Welcome back to the Astro-Insights podcast. Today we're moving continents from Africa over to America as we talk about a new generation planet with a new generation astrologer. With me today is Ada Pembroke, who is an astrologer and writer from the Pacific Northwest of the US. Ada is the author of The Gods of Time and the founder of the Narrative Astrology Lab. She brings her writing background and love of astrology together in the form of narrative astrology, which is a blend of evolutionary astrology, narrative theory, with a dash of revised Hellenistic techniques. So welcome, Ada.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm happy to be here.
So lots to talk about. And I should just say that you, the first millennial that I'm talking to on the podcast. So it's quite nice to be shifting generations. And I think it's very apropos of the topic, which we're kind of going to get into a little bit, which is all about Sedna and narrative astrology and Sedna's move into Gemini and her involvement in that configuration with Uranus, Pluto, and Saturn. So perhaps you can just kind of give us a brief intro into your astrology background, your journey.
I love that. I had a very long journey to astrology. I was actually raised in a very tiny little fundamentalist Christian sect called the Plymouth Brethren.
Okay.
Those very, very old school women have to cover their heads, are not allowed to talk, kind of very, very traditional evangelical churches. And so I believed for a long time that I was going to be on some kind of path that was very spiritually based, but I thought that it was going to be in a very different context. But then I went to college, and it kind of fell into the cliche of, the girl who goes to the big city and gets her horizons broadened. And by the time I reached grad school in my mid-20s, when I was starting my MFA in creative writing program, I was absolutely adrift spiritually in my life, had no idea what to do with myself. And I knew that moving very far away from the women are not allowed to speak environment that I grew up in was going to be very important for my journey. I majored in English language and literature in college. I then went on to get an MFA in creative writing. Communication was everything. And so I just happened to join an MFA program where Rachel Pollack, the author of 78 Degrees of Wisdom, a well-known figure in the tarot community, was a professor. The very first lecture that I heard when I was in college was her talking about the archetypes of the hanged man. And I was absolutely blown away by the idea that there could be this pack of cards that allows you to play with archetypes. And then over the course of the semester, she did writing workshops where we brought in the tarot and we played with those archetypes. And it felt like I was putting on almost like a skeleton for my identity. Like it was like scaffolding that I could start to build myself on. And through tarot, I discovered astrology. I discovered the evolutionary astrology of Stephen Forrest and the inner sky. And in a lot of ways, astrology allowed me to rebuild my sense of self in a time when I felt that my entire identity had been destroyed. So once I found astrology, I dove in with both feet. I decided that my next novel after finishing my MFA was going to be inspired by the Renaissance astrologer John Dee. And
Gosh.
yeah, I had no idea what I was getting into. I gave myself 6 months to learn Renaissance astrology. I thought that was very, very generous and giving myself a lot of time. 5 years later, I was sitting across from my mentor, decided that I knew absolutely nothing about astrology. And he was saying, you really should consider going pro. And I was like, are you kidding? I can't go pro. I know nothing. And it was kind of like, well, first, that's one of the signs that you should go pro. And also, you mean that you know nothing about your chart, but your chart is going to be the last one that you understand. And so I decided to dive into Stephen Forrest's apprenticeship program. I ended up printing out these business cards, and I was like, all right, I got to put something on these things other than my name. So I ended up putting narrative astrology on it. And I showed my mentor my business card, and he was like, you need to keep this. This is going to be very important for you. I was like, oh, okay, and I'm a writer, and um I'm an astrologer. I guess I'll combine narrative astrology someday, but it has become another one of those skeletons, those frameworks that I have returned to and returned to and returned to, the way that I return to my natal chart when I feel as though um, my my identity is getting just a little bit too thin.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I mean, I was so drawn to what you had to say about your experience at college and your discovery of first kind of tarot and then astrology. And I was wondering whether that was around about the time it was Saturn return.
Let's see. So that was 2010. No, I was about 25 at that point. My Saturn return was the decision to start working with my mentor. And
Ah, okay,
yeah,
interesting.
I spent a
Yeah.
couple of years exploring by myself, and then I was like, I can't do this alone. That was the point where I brought in a teacher.
Interesting. Yeah. So Saturn then was sort of embodied in the teacher. That's
Mm.
fascinating. Yeah. Anyways, a narrative astrology. So then, what kind of happened from there?
I have a stellium in Scorpio, so I have this pattern in my life of having periods where I feel like I'm wandering in the dark, but I don't really realize that I'm not actually wandering in the dark.
Uh huh.
Um, so I spent a few years really getting to know what it meant for me to be a professional astrologer. I
Hmm.
knew that I was not going to be. I very much um, admire and respect Stephen Forrest and my mentor Paul Richard, but I knew that I wasn't going to be doing exactly the kind of astrology that they were doing.
Hmm.
Um, I I have I have too much of the rebel in my chart, too much Aquarius to just follow along with the program. And so I did a lot of wandering for about 3 years, and then finally, I actually started doing these written readings on Tumblr of all places.
Interesting.
Tumblr has this feature where people can basically send you questions, and then you can answer them on your blog really easily. So it's a really great platform for building an advice column. At
Ah.
least technically, yeah. So I would open up these free readings, and I would be like, send me your chart and your birth data, and I will do a written reading here in public, kind of like an astrological advice column. And it went it went incredibly well, and a lot of the motivation for it was that I I was seeing my mentor, like, once or twice a month, but otherwise, I didn't know anybody who
Hmm.
who was at all interested in astrology. I knew that I wanted to be a professional at that point, but I just more than anything, I wanted people to talk to. And I slowly gathered this group of people who wanted to learn astrology with me. And I was like, all right, well, if I'm going to have people to talk to, I'm going to have to teach people to be able to speak this language with me. Um, and so my work as a professional and my work developing narrative astrology was very much in a conversation with this group of people. The identity of the group evolved quite a bit between 2018 and 2023 when
Hmm.
the name of the Narrative Astrology Lab really crystallized, and the identity just kind of went through this really big phase shift. But narrative astrology really came from those conversations with the group. We settled on the name Narrative Astrology Lab because it's an experimental community. We
Hmm.
discover things out in the wild, and then we bring it back to the group, and we start applying it to our charts, and we start seeing how it aligns, um,
So workshopping
and
it essentially.
very much workshopping it, and very much with the one of the underlying assumptions that I have about astrology is that the individual is the expert on their chart. And so if they hear a story that's just like, no, that doesn't speak to me in any way
Hmm.
whatsoever, then, the technique, frankly, needs to go out the window. So the big breakthrough that we had that really started to build narrative astrology as an idea itself was there were a group of people who just did not resonate with their sun signs in any way whatsoever. And we tried all kinds of archetypes, all kinds of different approaches, and it just wasn't working. And we
Interesting.
discovered the idea of sect from an astrology podcast episode
Yes,
by Chris Brennan.
yes.
And I went to them and I was like, I think that all of you were born at night. How do you feel about the moon? And all of a
Interesting.
sudden, they were like, yes, I feel so much better about my moon sign, my moon aspects, all of these things. And so we just started this process of taking the underlying free will assumptions of narrative
Yes.
astrology and we started bringing in these Hellenistic techniques and being like, what if we took the evolutionary approach, but instead of saying that you are your sun, what if you are your moon walking the path of your sun? And it was just one of those Uranian lightning bolt experiences that
Hmm.
just
Clicked.
really clicked. Exactly, it clicked for us, and that's really the kind of work that the Narrative Astrology Lab is built on. We bring these things that should work in theory, and then we ask, how is this actually playing out in your life? How does this actually connect with your story? And then what kind of story do you want to tell with this material?
Yes.
So we're all constantly, you know, the hinge between the past and the future in that way.
Yeah, interesting. And also, I think really kind of embracing this idea of kind of postmodern plurality, where
Yes.
you're not kind of saying a symbol means one thing. You really, I mean, I thought it was interesting that you talked about astrology as a language. It really is a language, and
Yes.
language, like anything, it's a living thing, and it evolves all the time, and it really it depends on who's speaking that language, and what those symbols and those words mean to that person. So it becomes very locational and individualistic, which I think is more suitable for the modern age, rather than sort of having these very set ideas about what planets mean, or like a cookbook type of a way of doing things. And I think it's interesting that you then, from the Hellenistic techniques, so you kind of went back and you revived the Hellenistic techniques and sort of introduced them into your practice in a way that I find quite interesting. I mean, I was talking to another astrologer here in London called Christine Skinner, and she was the one who actually turned me on to Sedna. I hadn't really thought about Sedna much at all. I don't really work too much with the Trans-Neptunian planets or the dwarf planets other than Pluto and Chiron. And she said something quite interesting, which I thought reflects what you're doing with your community, the Narrative Astrology Lab, which is she was saying, Pluto in Aquarius is very much about people working in groups, like through forums and these kind of collectives, that aren't necessarily all in one place, but you're either on Discord or you're kind of meeting via Zoom, or you're sort of in these places in cyberspace. So like Aquarians, that very air kind of energy, but it's a collective thing, and that seems very much what you're kind of doing with the Narrative Astrology Lab.
It's absolutely true. It's absolutely true. And I want to say you're very much speaking my language right now. But yes, this idea of um, deeply democratic, finding knowledge together, walking the path together idea is a very important part of my work, both in the lab and in my astrology readings themselves. Of course, every astrologer comes to their clients with deep respect, but I feel as though that in my practice, it's very important for me to come with a high degree of humility and see
Yes.
the reading very much as a collaborative process.
Yes.
I'm talking to someone who wasn't born yesterday and they know themselves and their lives so much better than I do. And so I try as best I can being aware of the natural power dynamics and a
Yes.
reading to make it a collaborative process. I ask as many questions as I answer.
Yeah, interesting, and sort of in that way becomes a dialogue.
Yes.
I was kind of mentored by Lindsay Rodemacher, who was head of Faculty of Astrology Studies, and I remember her always saying to me, you know, readings are very much a dialogue, not just between you and the client, but also with the chart itself. She would actually put up some kind of image of the chart so it could participate in the discussion, and then it becomes this very interesting dynamic where the chart sort of starts to kind of come alive and acts as this go-between almost between you and the client, and you, as you say, yes, you're creating a narrative together, you're co-creating, because the chart itself is also, so certainly as far as Lindsay's concerned, is it's also alive. It's a symbol, and it's this dynamic thing that moves with you as you grow. With transits and with progressions and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, interesting. And how did this idea of narrative astrology sort of evolve as you were doing this kind of this workshopping with people?
It was really, I love that you used the word dialogue, because I feel as though the idea of dialogue comes up in my work quite a lot in various ways. As narrative astrology was developing, there was very much a dialogue between the work that I was doing in the community that became the Narrative Astrology Lab, and also work that I was doing in my personal life. I spent a lot of time with books and journals, and going back to, I loved that you used the word postmodern, going back to the postmodern literary criticism that I did when I was working on my undergraduate degree, and trying to really come to a place that was using a lot of the criticism and critical thinking that I learned
Hmm.
as an English major in a way that was direct and approachable and down to earth. I have a Taurus sun, and so I believe that a lot of the deepest things actually come from simplicity. And so
Yes.
the major framework that we have in narrative astrology right now is a framework that I call the four questions.
Hmm.
But the four questions are basically designed to shift the power dynamic when you're dealing with a story. I believe that every single astrological interpretation is a story. It is a story that someone told, perhaps for good and empirical reasons. We have a lot of evidence that the early Mesopotamian astrologers who were watching the sky were very empirical about how they
Mm.
put their omens tablets
Yes.
together. And,
Yes.
I observed this, and then this happened, and then I
Yes.
saw this pattern happen over and over and over again. But even those empirical connections, I think that with every event, every transit, every needle placement, there are a million different ways that things can go. And so when we're dealing with a story, as a fiction writer, I like to take stories very seriously. It's part of my life's work, therefore it must be serious, right? Um, but also at the same time, it's a story can always be revised. A story can always be changed. And stories, I think you said a few minutes ago about stories being living things. And I love that, because one of the things that is absolutely beautiful about stories, especially when they live in the oral tradition, is that they change every time with the telling. They
Yeah.
are always a product of the moment. And so I want to bring that whiteness of being to
Mm.
approach to stories. And so that's fundamentally what the four questions is about. It's about taking these things that are so very integrated into our identities as our way of seeing the world, and basically taking our glasses off and cleaning the lenses and seeing the lenses themselves, that is the stories as lenses, as something that we can interact with and shift, and we can try on different stories and see how they change the way that we see things or change the way that we move through the world. it's a very playful process. I say sometimes that I feel like a personal stylist of the soul. I bring out, this costume and that costume, and it's like, how would it feel to put this on? How about this one? Does this one make you feel more like yourself? How about that one over here?
It's quite mercurial, actually. It's interesting. Then I keep thinking about, Gemini. Do you have placements in Gemini?
I have Mars, Chiron, and Ceres in Gemini, but I have Mercury and Aries directly on the midheaven to the degree. So I'm quite
Interesting.
a mercurial person.
Yes, it's a really interesting combination, actually, but it's perfect. And I think that this kind of gets to the heart of certainly the tradition that I was schooled in, which kind of surrounds the study of the alchemical Hermes. That
Mm.
Mercury is a liminal figure; he's a trickster, but he also allows for this playfulness, which is really important, actually, in not just in terms of creativity, but also in terms of magic. It's kind of opening oneself up, but it becomes almost that sort of liminal space where you can sort of like relax the structures, the sort of Saturnian structures of, like you were saying about the glasses, and say, all right, let's just relax those for a minute, and then see what else wants to come in, or let's experiment, let's play, let's kind of see, if we try a different perspective, or so it's interesting. It's really interesting. It sort of reflects this mercurial quality. So, I guess moving on slightly, I think one of the things that I was really interested in when I came across your work was your writings on Sedna, and I was fascinated by this idea that you were workshopping Sedna with your Narrative Astrology Lab, and also that you were working with Sedna in your clients' charts and things. So I just wondered how that sort of came about, and how did that process evolve, and where did it kind of lead you?
I love this story. And when you asked if I would talk about Sedna with you, I was so delighted to have the opportunity to tell this story again, because it's really one of my favorites. So I first stumbled on Sedna for the very first time in I was helping Astrology University with some transcription, and I had the opportunity to work with Alison Chester Lambert's lecture on the dwarf planets. And but I listened to her talk, and the part about Sedna just kind of put a pin in my mind. And
Hmm.
I didn't even realize it at the time, but it's almost like Sedna awoke for me
Hmm.
when I happened to get an anthology of Native American horror stories that I had asked for Christmas. My family has a tradition of giving each other books on Christmas Eve, and I am really enamored by the old tradition of ghost stories at Christmas. So I thought a collection of horror stories would be fantastic. And
It's very Dickensian of you. The Ghost of Christmas Past. Yeah.
but um, and the anthology was called "Don't Whistle at Night," and it's fantastic. It's
Hmm.
a lot of obscure writers, and they have such wonderful perspectives. But I decided that I would read one of the stories out loud to me and my husband, and I just opened up to the first one, and the first story in the collection just happened to be by a woman of Inuit descent who was writing about the myth of Sedna, and I was
Oh,
like, oh. Sedna's a dwarf planet. I know a little bit about Sedna because I listen to that talk by
wow.
Allison. And so I just went and opened my astrology software and put Sedna in to see what Sedna was doing. And I was like, oh, Sedna's on the cusp of Gemini. It's going back and forth between Taurus and Gemini. That's
Mm.
really interesting. I looked it up in my chart and was like, oh, I have Sedna opposite Pluto. Well, that's going to be fun.
Wow.
And square the moon in the AC too. So yeah, Sedna is very, very, very loud in my chart. For better or for worse. And so I looked at that and was like, oh, that's interesting, and just left it there.
Uh-huh.
I use Astro Gold, which leaves things that you're
Yes.
displaying in unless you take them out. And so every time I cast a chart after that, Sedna just happened to be there. And so it started to be a thing where every time I would do a reading, I have a very, very conversational style. I really love it when people come to me with questions and we can just have a conversation about the chart. And so
Mm.
I have a lot of space in my practice for the planets and the gods and goddesses to speak up and be like, hello, I have something important to say in this instance. So it kept on being relevant for me to say, have you ever heard the story of Sedna? And every time I told the story, the person I was talking to just started crying buckets. And I was like,
Wow.
oh, this
Mm. You've,
is this
you've
is
touched a
powerful.
nerve.
This is
Mm.
yeah, very much so. And so I felt self-conscious a bit because, I am not indigenous. I have never been anywhere near the Arctic where Sedna is from. And so I try to be very respectful of
Sure.
the spirits and myths and cultures of other people, recognizing that there is such a strong connection between the people and their stories. And so
Sure.
I was
Sure.
really reluctant to bring Sedna into my practice, but I was like, okay, I also at the same time believe that the archetypes and spirits have wills of their own. And it just became such a
Yes.
thing in my
Mm.
practice. It was so insistent that I was like, I'm gonna take this to the lab and see, um, what do they make of it? How does this actually play out in people's lives? And so I went to them and I was like, hey, and I'm working with this symbol. Can I sit down with you? And I forget how many people I sat down with. It was over a dozen people I sat down and had 30 to 60-minute long conversations about Sedna with. And by the time
Hmm.
I was done with it, I was like, this is really extraordinary. And this is a symbol that, as I'm sure we'll talk about, is incredibly timely for this moment. And so
Yes.
I gave a
Yes.
talk and
Absolutely.
I published about Sedna and yeah, she's become a figure in my practice. It's fortunately not every single reading is about
Hmm.
Sedna, which is good because it would be exhausting for
Intense.
everyone. Very intense, lots of tears. I'm really making her sound very approachable and good here, which is well, I mean it's honest. She's not a very approachable goddess or a spirit. She's at the bottom of the sea. She's very
Yes.
difficult to get to, but um, she has continued to just come up
Mm.
periodically as this constant little knocking reminder that I'm here and I'm important and please don't forget about me.
Interesting, because I mean, in the myth itself, she is essentially isolated and kind of becomes a cast off almost in the same way as the kind of Greek, the Greek scapegoating rituals. Um, so that's so interesting. And were there any themes that kept recurring in these charts when you would bring her up?
Yes. Unfortunately, one of the themes that came up over and over and over and over again was child abuse and neglect. Um,
Mm.
I was hoping that this was going to be one of those instances where this very dark story, um, Senna is killed by her father in the story. I was hoping that this was going to be a metaphor or something more abstract or indirect, but definitely a lot of very, very
Abandonment,
difficult abandonment, difficult relationships with
neglect.
parents, neglect, physical
Mm.
abuse, all of those kinds of things. Fortunately, that's not the whole story.
Mhm.
I have also noticed that people who have Sedna in career houses or connected with career placements have the tendency to be very strong advocates professionally. I worked with someone who was quite literally an advocate in human resources in her work. And so one of the things that we end up talking about quite a lot in those situations is how anger is important and a tool and necessary
Yes.
for these people to make friends with. There's a very strong theme of losing and finding yourself for people who have
Mhm.
strong sednas. Sedna has a very elliptical orbit, which means that she goes through periods of being much closer to the sun and periods of being much further away from the sun. When she's as far away from the sun as she can possibly get, she is halfway to the next star.
Yes. I mean, she takes what, 11? It's something like 11,400 years to do one orbit. Isn't that
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
The last time she was in this position, it was the end of the Ice Age. We were just
Interesting. Beginning
starting
of
to
the
go through the
Neolithic.
Neolithic Revolution. It's
Mm.
incredible.
Yeah, and I think what's also so interesting about her is that she's liminal in the sense that she's sort of
Yes.
sometimes really in the kind of the outer reaches of the galaxy where she, she's not visible, she's not sort of reachable, similar to the myth, and then at
Yes.
other times she's much closer, both to the sun and also to the earth, and then all this stuff starts to kind of come up from the depths. Yeah, we can see almost why the astronomers named her Sedna.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, I kind of, whilst I agree with you about cultural appropriation and being sensitive to cultures and to myths, I think also the kind of postmodern aspect of this does allow you to be a little bit more playful with the symbol. That's not necessarily exactly the same as the myth. You kind of start with the myth, but then the symbol itself starts to take on a life of its own. And this is what it's doing with these charts. As you're hearing the stories of these different people that you are doing readings for.
And so the interesting dances that we dance with as astrologers, on the one hand,
Mm,
uh, giving credit where credit is due is very important
yes,
in the
yes,
conversation,
yes.
especially in the United States, I think, at the moment. But on the other hand, Sedna has her own identity and her own will. And if there's one thing that she has shown me over and over and over again is that she can't be contained. She
Yeah,
she will do what she
interesting.
wants.
Yeah, interesting. So it has that kind of quality similar to Lilith of
Yeah,
kind of being a little bit wild, and a little bit sort of
absolutely.
not
Yes.
easy domesticated. And in fact, I mean, that's very much part of the story. For those of our listeners who don't know the story of Sedna, maybe you could just give us a quick little summary.
I would be happy to. One of the interesting things about the myth of Sedna is that Sedna is part of the mythology of peoples who live over a very, very wide area. People work with Sedna all the way from the middle of the top of Alaska all the way out to Siberia. So, practically the entire top of the land that is along the Arctic Ocean.
Yes, the
Um,
Arctic Circle. Interesting.
Yes. Yes. So there are many stories of Sedna, which I delight in because it allows me to play with many different kinds of
Yes.
costumes,
Yes.
um, and many different interpretations. And so what
Mm.
they all have in common is this story of a woman who is reluctant to get married.
Hmm.
She finally gets married and leaves her parents that she's very close to. She's tricked. As
Mm.
soon as she goes to her new home with her husband, she discovers that he is a seabird or an ocean spirit or something that she really did not anticipate.
Mm.
Um, but in this particular story, this is not good news. She suddenly finds
Mm.
herself married to a supernatural seagull or some kind of monster, and she's miserable. And so she calls out to her
Yes.
parents and asks them to bring her back home. And her father retrieves her. And at this point, um, we we know that there is a storm,
Hmm.
and in the process of trying to save himself from the storm, the father picks Sedna up out of the boat, throws her into the ocean. And then when she goes to pull herself back into the boat, he chops off her fingers, one
Mm.
knuckle at a time, so that
Hmm.
she is unable to pull herself back into the boat. She sinks to the bottom of the ocean and she becomes the ruler of one part of the Inuit underworld. Um, the
Interesting.
dead in Inuit mythology end up finally on the moon. That is
Okay.
their land of the dead.
Right.
But they spend a year on the bottom of the ocean with Sedna going through this purification process. And so
Hmm.
she is the ruler of that process. And then in my world, spirits like that, I call them goddesses as a sound of respect. But the Inuit are very definite that she's just a crazy woman under the sea. She's not a goddess. They don't have gods and goddesses in their mythology. And so the way that the Inuit have classically related to her is they have seen her as the mother of sea mammals because her fingers turned into all of the sea mammals. And The people
Uh,
who work with her are the people who have traditionally relied entirely on sea mammals for their source of sustenance.
Interesting.
And she goes through these depressive episodes where she thinks that the world is horrible, that people are horrible. She withdraws all of the sea mammals away from the places where the hunters can reach them. And spiritual practitioners from Inuit communities will go into shamanic journey, and they will go to the bottom of the ocean with a comb and comb out
Mhm.
Sedna's hair and reassure her that there are good people out there. It's not all evil. Not everybody is your father. We're trying our best to be good. And also, will you please allow us to eat?
Interesting. So a Persephone aspect to her
Yes.
in an interesting kind of way. This is something that Molly McCord was talking about in a podcast that she did, I think in 2023. And I thought it resonates quite well that she's almost the oceanic, the Neptunian version of Persephone.
Yes.
So she's kind of spending time in the depths of the ocean, and she's also associated with food in the same way that Persephone, represents spring when she comes back to the surface of the earth. So the riches of the earth, what's been hibernating under the soil, kind of bursts into life, and you can sort of see it. So in a similar way that there's all this stuff going on emotionally beneath the surface. I mean, for me, certainly, I don't know about you, but I do associate the ocean very much with emotions, and as well as the more kind of collective stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very harsh myth, but it does speak. I think it's interesting that she's kind of come into my consciousness as sort of in the collective. We are seeing all these stories about Jeffrey Epstein. We just had the P. Diddy trial. There's
Mm.
so much out there about kind of misogyny, abuse, domestic abuse. There's this sort of resurgence of the trad wife, and
Yes.
and all that kind of brings up. And it does seem interesting that Sedna at this time is making that conjunction to Uranus
Yes.
um, in Gemini, and of course that she ingressed into Gemini in, I think it was June of 2023, and
Yes.
then again in April, I think, of 2024. So yeah, her kind of time in Gemini is quite sort of fresh and kind of new. Because I mean, at this stage for me, like it's because she's such a new planet in the astrological pantheon. You kind of feel like, what does she actually stand for? We haven't had like
Yes.
200 years or 3,000 years or whatever it is, just to kind of work with the symbol yet. And so obviously a good point of reference is to see what's happening in the collective when she kind of makes her appearance. And I mean, I was so struck by this aspect of her, of the kind of the violence and her isolation. And I think I even said this to you in an email that when I read some of your stuff, I instinctively felt that the way that you talked about her resonated a lot with the work of Rebecca Solnit and her description of the conflicted and defensive role that women are forced to play in response to increasing like misogyny and sort of violence from the patriarchy, which is so aptly embodied by Sedna's father. And I think I even wrote something like, I'm especially drawn to the line in her essay, Men Explain Things to Me, where she writes, it's as though women have to turn themselves into nuns with axes to be safe.
Oof.
And I mean, I do think that, I don't know whether you agree with me, that she does bring to the surface things that are very uncomfortable, experiences and emotions that are incredibly uncomfortable to talk about, let alone to re-experience. If you are one of your clients, who has kind of had this, and yet of course there's the healing aspect of doing that, of talking
Yes.
about
Absolutely.
and feeling seen and having your experiences validated. And I wondered whether, like, what you thought about that in terms of the archetype of Gemini as the storyteller, all of that kind of stuff, all the communication stuff.
You've put so many wonderful things on the table. I feel like Sedna is incredibly difficult to material. She brings incredibly difficult things to the surface. She's definitely a very Plutonian figure.
Mm.
In my work, I have the tendency to have very, very difficult conversations with people. I'm known for my article on the 12th house sun.
Mhm.
I'm known for my work with Pluto, and I'm known for my work with Sedna, and none of these are easy conversations. Sedna is the only one who consistently makes people cry.
Mm.
Even Pluto, and even the people who are coming for those 12th house sun conversations, which are so very raw and so strike such a nerve. Sedna is even more intense than that. But
Mm.
I really don't think it's an accident that she's really starting to um, speak up at this time. Um,
Mm.
she really started to come to my consciousness in 2023, just as she was like it was weeks before she moved into Gemini, and so like
Huh.
um it was a very profound time. But I
Yes.
it doesn't feel to me like it's an accident that she has become such
Yes.
a big part of my work, because so much of what narrative astrology is about is telling healing stories. I hear people
Mm.
come to narrative astrology because they have stories that don't fit. They have identities that don't fit. They have been told who they should be. They have been silenced in different ways. I don't love the wounding of the feminine, but I appreciate that you brought up all of this violence against women, and all of
Mm.
these ways in which we've had these decades of women's liberation, and we are um
Yes.
as a millennial, I'm constantly reminded that there are people alive right now who were adults and not able to get credit cards, at least here in the United States,
Yes.
without their husband's permission. And so
Mm.
it's a constant reminder to me of how far my mothers have brought us, and how far we thought when I was growing up we would be able to
Yes.
go. And this falling back, it just feels to
Yes.
me so much like collectively women are there with Sedna falling into the ocean, and we don't know how deep this is going to get.
Yes, and also the kind of the chopping off of the fingers, that there is something
Yes.
very violent about it. I mean, I must say, like,
Yes.
this was not something I was really aware of until, I guess, the lockdowns. So sort of 2020, and I kind of went back onto Twitter. I'd had an account for years, and I hadn't really sort of bothered with Twitter, and
Mm.
and sort of went back on, I guess, after Trump was kicked off. I thought, all right, well, this is a platform I can have a little bit of respect for, um, and was horrified at the way that that women were being portrayed, kind of on there, and the kind of all the stuff that was sort of, I guess, had been swirling around for many years, certainly within the alt right kind of manosphere, and that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
And it's kind of become more and more evident, and sort of out in the open, I guess, since, Musk took over the platform, and the Overton
Yes.
window has shifted kind of rightward, that people are sort of feeling more comfortable about talking about this stuff. But at the same time, what I found it interesting is that women were also starting to speak up.
Yes.
And so all the stuff that had been kind of bubbling below the surface, here, for instance, there'd been the murder of a girl called Sarah Everard, by a policeman who was supposed to be protecting
Mm.
her. And people were quite shocked at her vigil. The rage that women who had come to attend the vigil were experiencing, and it really touched a nerve, and it was quite clear that there was something going on. And this
Yes.
sort of blew the lid off the whole thing. And then I saw the Twitter thing, and I was just quite horrified. Because, as you say, it did feel as though we were getting somewhere. And I suppose it's interesting that at that stage, Senna was probably towards the end of her tour through Taurus. And then she sort of shifted into Gemini in 2023. And that's when, to me, the sort of these stories started to really erupt into mainstream media. And when you started to hear more about Andrew Tate with his trial, his rape trial, and that sort of
Yes.
stuff. So, and I guess, as you were saying, this is part of the process of healing,
Mhm.
is that first you have to say these things, the quiet part, out loud,
Yes.
um, and have these things acknowledged and accepted by the community. Was That's what made me think so much of the the Greek stories was that it's almost as though, whoever the scapegoat is silenced. Like they have to take on all the uncomfortable feelings of the community and then get pushed out, sort of ostracized. And this kind of almost feels like the scapegoat coming back, like Sedna surfacing, from the depths and saying, "I'm not going away," like the Epstein victims. But what I also thought was interesting was, just as I think you and I were talking about this over email, is that just as Sedna was forming part of that grand trine with Pluto sort of in August, we had these women kind of almost taking their power back and saying, well, we're not
Yes.
waiting for a sort of a list of people to be released by, was it Congress? We make our own list. We know who the people were. And, one of them kind of saying, we don't want revenge, we want justice. And we don't see ourselves as victims, we see ourselves as survivors. And I thought that was really empowering. And, I thought, well, gosh, is this speaking to Sedna? And then, of course, you did your workshop recently, which was about rewriting your story. And I thought, gosh, it all feels quite synchronous.
Again, there's so much material there. Yeah, it's so much is going on, and it's so relevant. And I love that you brought in the triangle that she's involved in right now. She's conjunct Uranus, and so we have these shocking things related to words. There's
Yes.
a sextile to Saturn and also Neptune that when Saturn and Neptune are conjunct next year, is going to be in a very, very close a sextile with Sedna, and also
Yes.
that trine with Pluto. And so they form that little mini triangle.
Yes.
But I think it's so interesting that there's this dynamic where it's like women and women's issues keep on bobbing back up to the surface. Like it feels to me like we're in that moment in the story where we are absolutely insistent that we are going to climb back into the boat, and we think that that is the way that we're going to get our power back. But I don't really know what this means. I'm just going along with the story at the moment. But it isn't until she reaches the bottom of the sea that she really finds her power. And something that
Yes.
feels true to me in a way that I can't really explain is that I think that we are really going to find our power when we stop trying to get back into the boat and we discover that, frankly, we control the food supply. I mean, that's what Sedna is. You will.
Yes.
It reminds me of the story Lysistrata that the ancient Greeks told. It was a play that was basically about women being uh, furious at the way that men were engaging in war and refused to stop fighting. And women were like, you're not going to have sex with us until you end this war. And
Yes. Yes. So this is similar to the 4B
for
movement
me, yes.
in South Korea. Some of them call it the Independence Day movement.
Yes.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting interpretation. So are you, in that metaphor, are you kind of seeing the boat as being sort of like mainstream society, or you seeing it as the patriarchy?
I think that, every symbol can be 1,000 different things. And so
Yes.
I want to be respectful of the people who are listening to this. But I think that one of the problems, and of course, the feminist scholars have been talking about this for eons and eons, but when we try to climb into the boat of patriarchy, there's this idea that, oh, we can remake things from the inside, can't we?
Mm, mm.
I don't think that we can.
Yes, or you're kind of expected to be like almost like Athena, or one of those goddesses who takes on more masculine features, who becomes a goddess of war and that sort of thing.
Exactly.
This
Exactly.
idea of having to be like men when
Mhm.
women don't necessarily want to be like men.
I think that, and I want to be aware of the fact that we have the tendency in these types of conversations collectively to think, oh, if you're not climbing into the boat, and participating in the patriarchy, then you must either be withdrawing from society and living in a tiny shack somewhere at the bottom of the sea, or you must be, participating in these very women's spaces, or like, are we getting to some kind of conversation where we're advocating trad wifery? But none of these things, I think, are the thing, because I think that all of these stories in their different ways are ways of participating in the binaries of the patriarchy, the power and the powerless. And somehow we have to climb out of the system itself and stop seeing it in these terms. But as long as we're in the system is going to insist on trying to put things in its terms.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I kept thinking too, back to what you were saying earlier about anger, and I would sort of like suggest that women and men have very different relationships with anger. Men have
Mm.
Mars. It's much more sort of directed. It's more acceptable to be aggressive if you're male. Women's anger does tend to be like that icy sea of the Arctic, a lot of the time. You know, it kind of festers. This is sort of simmering resentment below the surface, and then might sort of express itself in quite passive aggressive ways. Like we were talking about with the that movement in South Korea. Yes. So in that sense, that women find it difficult to express anger a lot of the time. Because it's not, it's certainly within in kind of patriarchal society, it's not seen as very feminine. If you're kind of angry, then you're sort of like some kind of banshee, or you are sort of like, um, it's similar to what you were saying about the mad woman, that there's something very alien about
Yes.
anger. And I thought it was interesting that Sedna is a red planet. Apparently, she's almost as red as Mars. So I thought that was quite fascinating too. So maybe in that sense, she is a kind of a female form of anger that has to be sort of alchemized and worked with so that it doesn't kind of eat you alive inside, and can be expressed in constructive ways, like these Epstein victims that are sort of talking about truth, saying, well, we're going to form our own list. We
Yes.
don't need the sort of patriarchal politicians to sort of come out and give us this official list. We can sort of do it on our own terms, and we're going to use this as a process within our kind of structure to perhaps warn other women, or to compare experiences, or maybe collect testimonies, or whatever the case may be. And also what you were saying too about her conjunction to Uranus too, because Uranus is a natural outsider and a rebel.
Yes.
So that's a very interesting combination. I mean, kind of thoughts on that?
You said the Independence Day movement, and I laughed because there we have the Uranus conjunction. It's just so it's so absolutely perfect. And one of the things that I love about Uranus is that it is a constant reminder of the tendency to, Shakespeare said all the world's a stage and everyone is a player. We
Yes.
have the tendency to put together these things that we think are reality, but they're really just a cultural play, a cultural
Yes.
theater.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Uranus busts through the movie screen, busts onto stage, and suddenly start talking directly to the audience and just completely shattering the fourth wall of suspension of disbelief in order to,
Yes.
awaken us. And I think that it is absolutely perfect that we have this conjunction between Sedna and Uranus, because going back to what you were saying about anger and about Sedna being a red planet, this is deeply personal for me, because I have a very, very martial planet. I have Mars
Mhm.
sextile the ascendant. Depending on what planets you use, I have 6 placements in Mars ruled signs. And
Ah.
so I think that, I'm speaking from that place when I speak about anger. I think that a lot of women um, create these ocean bottoms for ourselves, these bottoms of the
Mm.
sea where we go and rage, and that is where um, we have these safe places to let our Mars out, to be in that red hot anger. But it's the thing about the redness of Sedna, and I love that you brought that up, is Sedna's redness doesn't come from iron. It's not the steel
Mm.
of swords and guns. Her
Yes.
redness is thalens. And scientists currently believe that thalens are the building blocks of life. a lightning bolt hit some
Ah,
tholins in the sea. And that's when we first got the first, little microorganisms.
plankton.
And yes, exactly. And so something that, the Hawaiians know very well is the connection between volcanic eruptions and life. They owe their life to the volcanoes. They owe their life to that anger, that violence,
Huh.
that redness. And so when we bring the lightning bolt of Uranus together with the tholins of Sedna, yes, we get anger, but that also creates life. Lightning brings fertility to the soil. Lightning comes with rain, which brings fertility to the soil. And so I think
Yes.
that what we are seeing is, volcanic islands are built when those ocean bottom places where we go to rage get closer and closer and closer to the surface, the more we erupt and the more we erupt. And I'm hoping that this moment where, the Epstein survivors are releasing their own lists are one of those moments where we aren't breaking through the glass ceiling into the patriarchy. We aren't climbing into the boat. We are building a whole new world.
Yes, I mean that's fantastic. And you know what occurred to me when you were saying it was I'm quite big into the I Ching, and I kind of use it quite a lot as a sort of a complement to the astrology. And sometimes I work with human design, which actually combines the two things. And I happened to do a divination the other day, and the hexagram that came up was hexagram 51, which is a fertile shock.
No, you're kidding. That's amazing.
Very often, what happens when I do an I Ching reading is I often find that some planets are transiting through that particular hexagram. Um, but I just want to quickly read you the little it's called Shake, Rousing, and it's all about rolling thunder. So it's a disturbing and fertilizing shock. Wake up, stir up, return of life in early spring, the rouser and the exorcist. So it says Shen is about a violent thunderclap or an earthquake, which brings about a decisive moment, often initially terrifying, but afterwards people all start laughing. And but once they've kind of calmed down, and then the situation sort of reverses. So it says a disturbing and inspiring shock, which will rouse things into new activity. Um, Let the shock shake up old beliefs and begin something new. It's kind of signified by the beginning of spring, when the Chinese believed that these thunderclaps of sort of spring storms would wake up the insects and the plants in the earth, and this would sort of rouse the planet into kind of springtime. So I thought that was really interesting what you were saying about volcanoes. And also what I thought was fascinating was around about the time that Sedna was doing this thing in 2023, when in fact she tried Pluto in Capricorn in 2023 as
Yeah.
well. Uh, it kind of came to me when I was doing my forecast for one of the eclipses, I think. It might have been an eclipse in Aries, actually. And I got this image of a volcano. And in fact, I quoted from Ursula Le Guin, who said, "Women are volcanoes. When we women offer our experience as our truth, as human truth, all the maps change. There are new mountains." So isn't this fascinating? I love it when this happens.
Me
Um,
too. I literally have chills right now. This is incredible.
yeah, I'm just gobsmacked myself. So yeah, I mean, it does feel like there's rich material to work with there. I mean,
Absolutely.
when I thought it was interesting that you started working with Sedna and that you got this opposition to Pluto, because Pluto is also the god of the underworld and is
Yes.
the partner of Persephone.
Yes.
I think it's really interesting that you seem to be naturally drawn with your Pluto opposition to Sedna to work with these clients. I mean, do they sort of say anything afterwards about what the reading kind of did for them? Have you had any feedback?
Yeah, I think that you're definitely onto something about the power of speaking and the power of telling your own story. Something that happens quite a lot in my readings is that, people will come to me and they haven't had a place where they can tell their story. In the United States, at least, we have a really big issue where mental health care is very difficult to get. Therapy is incredibly expensive. And so there's this sense that, people are not in counseling who need to be, people are not in therapy who need to be, because it has been extremely medicalized. And so people will come to an astrology reading and they will have never been to therapy, or they haven't been in therapy for a long time, or therapy means sitting down with the therapist for 15 minutes, getting a CBT technique, and then being sent on their way with a
Yes.
copay.
Yes. Mhm.
And so they will sit down and they will just open their mouths, and there will be this eruption of story. And they will get to
Mhm.
the end of the reading, and often they'll be like, "You didn't say a word." And I will be like, "The story that needed to be told was told today, and it was yours. And that was the most important thing that could have happened."
Mhm.
And I wonder sometimes what would happen if people had better access to, even, I hate to talk about friendship as a thing to have access to, but people are so lonely. And that comes up
Yes.
so much in my
Yeah.
work with Sedna.
And especially with
But
Uranus, I keep thinking of Uranus as the sort of the loner, the outsider, and also the severer or the splitter.
yes.
This with this kind of disconnection epidemic, which is largely driven by technology.
And a lot of the transformation, aside from just the experience of being allowed to speak and having someone who will hold the space for an hour
Mm.
and
Mhm.
not interrupt. I've gotten to the place where I understand that sometimes my job is to sit there and be an active listener. But aside from those times, the people who have the biggest transformations with me tend to be the people who have a lot of those quote unquote dark feminine placements in their chart. They have a very
Oh.
strong Lilith, they have a
Mhm.
very strong Sedna, and there's this moment that comes up over and over and over again where there's this lightning bolt of realization, if I'm going to be in hell, I'm going to be the queen of hell.
So very Persephone.
It it is. And I loved earlier how you brought up, the beginning of spring and its connection in Chinese culture. I mean, of course, that's when Persephone comes back to the land of the living as
Yes.
well and becomes the goddess of
Yes.
flowers. And so
Yes, and she returns to Demeter, so she kind of comes back to the Mother Earth. Yes, and the other thing that struck me about the Sedna myth was, where is her mother? In all of this.
that is such a good question. The version of the myth that I'm most familiar with is the one that was written by Rachel Kinsolek Tinsley, who is
Uh-huh.
a Innuit woman, who's very fascinating. One of the themes that we haven't really touched on quite yet is Sedna's role with translation, which I think is going to be very important in
Mhm.
chatty Gemini. And Rachel is a translator in between English and the Inuit language. And
Ah.
her mother appears in the story, but it's always Sedna's parents. And
Oh,
like,
okay.
yeah, so Rachel hasn't forgotten the mother, but it's very much this pairing of the mother and the father, almost a kind of sideways Gemini kind of thing. Like you get the two of them together, except for the end part where the father's in the boat.
Yes, yes. So very much the mother is very much the trad wife who kind of defers to the father, the patriarch.
Yeah. Ooh.
Yes. But it's also
Oh,
absent. I mean, I thought it was
yes.
interesting that, we're talking about it's the icy ocean. So it's not just
Hmm.
the normal ocean, it's the icy ocean with all these kind of like icebergs and and all of this kind of stuff. So there's an element of iciness um about the whole thing. And I kind of thought, is this a metaphor for sort of feeling that fonder withholding mother, or the kind of the distant mother, in Sedna's
Yes.
story, that she doesn't seem to have the support network of, or like a supportive figure in the mother who's there to kind of comfort her in her sort of abandonment and her betrayal sort of thing, or intercede on her behalf so that the father doesn't chop off her fingers.
Yes.
Um, yeah, there's something very interesting about that. Yeah.
It's a story that comes from a very brutal environment, and
Yes.
also an environment that is very deeply unkind to the systems of civilization. Something that
Yeah.
Rachel has written a ton of essays about Inuit culture, and I'm so very grateful for her willingness to share that to the world. She's just published them online and they're freely available. It's wonderful.
Okay.
But she talks about how one of the differences between Inuit culture and Western culture is that Inuit culture is very much about the individual, whereas Western culture is very much about systems. And you were talking about icebergs, and the first thing that popped into my head was, yes, this is the ocean that sunk the Titanic.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that maybe, in a perverse way, that's actually a bit of a message of hope, because we're in a moment where there are so many things that feel impossible to
Insurmountable.
never sink.
Yes.
Yes, with the war
Yes.
in Gaza, that's never going to end.
Mhm.
We live
Mhm.
in the era of the perpetual crisis. And yet here we have this spirit who's definitely not a goddess, who comes from the land that sinks the Titanic. And what a perfect
Yes,
moment for
yes.
her.
And also, is the Titanic just a bigger sort of boat that the father was in, in that sense?
Oh, yeah.
And yes, and I can't help but think that Sedna has kind of come into our consciousness just as Donald Trump is talking about trying to annex Greenland, which of course is part of the Arctic Circle. And of course the Prime Minister of Denmark is a woman, who's kind of pushing back and saying, no, you can't have Greenland. You know, what are you thinking? So it's fascinating. We live in interesting times. I think that's probably the best way to put it.
We do.
Very interesting
We
times.
absolutely do.
Um, but at the same time, miraculous things are also happening. I mean, we're recording this sort of on the same day as the ceasefire in Israel Gaza, which nobody thought would happen. So I mean, it is really interesting that out of this time of chaos, you also have these moments of like, how did that happen? Very Uranian.
Incredibly
Yeah.
Iranian. I'm sitting here in shock actually, because I have a practice of never looking at the news in the morning, and
Oh yes.
we started recording this at 11 a.m. my time, so I hadn't looked at the news. You just said that about the ceasefire. I had no idea.
None.
So speaking of shocking,
Oh well, there you go. Yeah, yeah. That's
wonderful.
yeah. Gosh, well, this has been absolutely fascinating, Ada. Thanks so much for taking the time. I definitely think we'll have to come back and perhaps check in a little while and see where we've got to with Sedna.
I would love that.
I'd also love to sort of talk a little bit more about your lab at some other point. But for listeners who are interested, I'll be putting a link in the show notes about Ada's Narrative Astrology Lab and also the courses that she's running currently, which are about rewriting your stories. So
Yes.
check that out if you're interested. And perhaps also, Ada, you might share a link to the stories that you mentioned just now, the Inuit stories.
I have a
Sedna.
page on my website where I share all of my writing about Sedna, and also I have a resources page where I link to all of the essays that I've found that are relevant, books that I've read, just everything that has influenced my work. So you can find that by going to my website, adapembroke.com/Sedna. It's kind
Perfect.
of my home base for Sedna things.